Good afternoon or good midday to everyone. Welcome all. We're so excited to have you here today. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director here at the Karsh Institute of Democracy. I want to thank our wonderful staff, Vivian, Jessica, and many others who've helped to make this possible. And we're particularly delighted to welcome two of our dear colleagues here today. This is the first event of the year in a series called Touchstones of Democracy. We have 3 events each semester, so we hope that you'll come back and keep an eye out for the others. I'll just mention that September 19th, we'll have a conversation about a new book by Carola Binder called Shock Values, Prices and Inflation in American Democracy, so about the relationship between economic policy and democracy, and we'll be in conversation with Michael Lennox of the Darden School. And then on November 20th, we'll welcome Eric Kleinenberg, who's the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the author of a book about 2020 and its political and cultural legacies. And that conversation will be led by Claudrina Harold of UVA's History Department. These events always happen the same way. We have lunch at 11:30. We'll have books for sales and signings by the authors. So we hope that you'll come back and also spread the word. And we also urge you to check out the Karsh Institute mailing list. We have a lot of programming coming up this fall on the 2024 election, around a project on digital technology and democracy and other themes. And I think there's no better way to begin this year, momentous year, as we all know, for democracy in the world, with a conversation about the global state of democracy and the role of the US within the broader ecosystem. So we're grateful to have the chance today to welcome John Owen, who has been a key collaborator with us over the years, to discuss his illuminating and vital new book, The Ecology of Nations. I'm just going to hold it up, but you can make sure to get a copy outside. This conversation will be led by James Davison Hunter, the LeBrosse Levinston Distinguished Professor of Religion, Culture, and Social Theory at UVA, and Executive Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. The Institute has been a generative institution here at UVA for many decades, welcoming and supporting fellows, sustaining rich programming, and publishing the Hedgehog Review. Professor Hunter is a prolific and adventurous intellectual who has written searchingly on questions about the deep structures of meaning and morality in our changing and political and cultural matrix. He's published 9 books and written many articles for both academic audiences and the broader public. His very influential book, Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America, was published in 1991. He returned to some of its themes in 2006 in Is There a Culture War? A Dialogue on Values in Public Life. More recently, in 2018, he's published Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality. And his latest book is Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis, which I've been reading this summer. It's rich and illuminating engagement with our contemporary moment. Professor Hunter has also served on the National Council for the National Endowment for the Humanities, consulted with the White House and National Commission on Civic Renewal, and kind of been a part of a lot of important public conversations. So we thank you so much for being with us, James, and I'll turn it over to you to further introduce
Great.
John and lead the conversation.
Laurent, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. I want to thank Melody. I don't know if Melody is here, but I wanted to thank Melody and the staff of the Karsh Institute as well as the supporters of the Karsh Institute for hosting this event. Not only this, but for the organization that's being built here and the important work that you are supporting. I'm deeply grateful, so thank you. Among the most important intellectual quests of this and succeeding generations is the quest to both understand the nature and roots of the crisis attending liberal democracy in our day, and to reflect meaningfully on the ways to preserve its extraordinary legacy into the future. To see the crisis of democracy through the lens of the media and many political actors and activists is to see the crisis as the fault of the other side. Each side blames the other for all that is wrong with the nation. And indeed, if we are only looking at the text of public and political life, we might be tempted to see things this way ourselves. But scholars understand that text never stands alone. There's always context and subtext, non-obvious dynamics at work, that to grasp them is to complexify our understanding and to make wise intervention even more challenging. It's a special honor and privilege for me to engage John at this event. Our conversation is always rich and rewarding for me, often to the point of distraction and neglect. And I want to tell you one story. It just happened. I didn't know this, but I showed up a couple of years ago at the Charlottesville International Airport. And at the American Airlines area, and John showed up as well. Well, we started a conversation. John was going to Boston to give a lecture, and I was heading to New York. So as we waited for our respective flights, we got lost in conversation. Really lost. Neither of us heard the announcement for our flights. We missed our flights. When we finally looked up at one point, we went to the desk, and they told us, oh, those flights left about a half hour ago. So we scrambled and arranged flights out of Richmond, which meant we got an Uber to Richmond and continued our conversation for another hour and a half. By the time we got there, John had missed his flight to Boston. He ended up driving to Washington to catch a flight. Turns out he was late for his own talk. I did finally make it to New York.
If you're late to your own talk, are you really late?
All of this is to say that we may still be talking here long after the event is over and you've gone home for dinner. John then is a friend and a colleague. He's also a formidable figure in the realm of international relations with a national and international reputation. He's the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor of Politics. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and at the Miller Center. He's the author of Liberal Peace, Liberal War, The Clash of Ideas in World Politics, Confronting Political Islam, 6 Lessons from the West's Past, and this year, The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile World Order with Yale University Press, as well as dozens of articles on the same themes. Clearly, John asks big questions and wrestles with big ideas. What marks his work throughout is his skill at marrying theory, history, and normative concerns to important policy-relevant questions. That breadth is rare these days, yet it is those qualities that distinguish him in the world of international relations, but also in the larger scholarly world as well. We've worked on a number of projects over the years. Perhaps the most rewarding has been the co-editorship of a series entitled Politics and Culture at Yale University Press. Though I'm an Americanist working out of historical and cultural sociology, he studies, as you know, the entire world from the discipline of political science, politics, and IR. Our shared burden, though, is a common recognition that there's a crisis in liberal democracy, both here and abroad, and that while institutions tend to be stable, nothing is permanent. Thoughtful people genuinely wonder if a substantive democracy has a future. We, of course, mostly are fixated on the troubles that beset American democracy. And though our troubles are more or less distinctive, they are not unique. There are dynamics at work that are world historical in character, which brings us to the topic and theme of your new book. So to begin, could you lay out the broad parameters of the basic argument of your book?
Happy to, James, and thank you. And thank you for raising that story I buried in memory about Charlottesville Airport. But I think we'll be saved today by the question and answer period. That will force us to stop.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all for coming. This is a great privilege for me to talk about my work with my distinguished colleague. The book is about what ails American democracy, and there are many books about this, many articles about this. I commend James Hunter's new book on this topic. Most of those books, I think it's fair to say, understandably look to the United States, look within the United States for the sources of problems with our democracy. We're a big country. We often forget there's a world out there in which we operate, and that actually influences what we do and how we are and how we conduct our business. These books that focus solely on the United States are of great value. I read them, I take them seriously, I borrow ideas from them. But I specialize, as James said, in international relations. And so I'm very interested in America and its international context. And so I'll make, probably it'll be 5 quick points to kind of lay out what the book tries to do. And the first thing the book does is it notices and describes a fact James alluded to. The United States is not the only country whose democracy is in trouble. There are, my wife and I just spent a sabbatical in the UK, and there are problems there. There are problems on the continent of Europe. If you follow European politics and recent elections, you know this. So these wealthy, mature democracies, you could call them, have not the same identical problem, but there's a family resemblance having to do with discontent with institutions that we all thought 30 years ago were all set. So 30 years ago, Francis Fukuyama said we're at the end of history and liberal democracy has won, and there's some problems yet to solve, but they're not about how to govern ourselves. We know that. That was a long time ago. It seems a very long time ago. People really are questioning the institutions that we have in common. And this takes shape in the form of polarization, really radical polarization, where some societies are split, and ours really is a 50-50 country where each side increasingly regards the other as an enemy, as an internal enemy, something to be got rid of. Again, but the fact that we're not the only country going through something like this says a lot, says something to me about that. There's something going on internationally. It's not just about us. So that's point 1. Point 2 is, I've been struck for many years at how, if you look at world history, just for the last century, but you could extend it back in time, you'll notice that there seem to be some times when it's very hard for countries to be democratic, to be democracies, like the 1930s. Democracy was really in retreat, and fascism on the far right and communism on the far left seemed to be advancing. There are other times and places when it seems easy to be a democracy. The 1990s, which I mentioned a minute ago, when the smart money seemed to be on liberal democracy forever and ever. So, and now we're in a period, it's not as bad as the 30s. If you look back at the 1930s, it really was grim then, and the Great Depression, World War II was yet to come. So it's not that bad. But still, it's not the 90s either. So we seem to be in a period where it's harder than we thought it would be to be a democratic country. And that leads me to think in environmental or ecological or evolutionary terms, which is to say, we can conceive of something called the international environment that sometimes selects for democracy, to use that evolutionary language, and sometimes does not. Sometimes it selects for authoritarianism of various types. So that's a major conceptual move the book does, and I try to make it do a lot of work. When you start to think about this, that we're in an environment that can be friendly or hostile toward democracy, it opens up a new set of problems and questions and a new way to think about what's going on in the world. The third point is, things are not going well because the environment really isn't selecting very well for democracy. And there I talk about 2 big problems. These are not easy problems. They're not even easy to describe. They're certainly not easy to remedy. But the first is the United States has a great deal of leverage, influence over that same international environment. So I said a minute ago, we Americans are accustomed not really to think about the world out there because we're so powerful and rich and consequential. And that's true. I articulate that as follows. The United States has, of all the countries in the world, the most influence over that international environment that can select for democracy or for authoritarianism. And lately, we haven't been doing a very good job of it. And I articulate this in the sense of what's happened to liberalism, the kind of animating philosophy of this country since its founding, a political doctrine that holds individual liberty to be the highest political good. We have practiced that in different ways since the founding of this country. The liberalism we have now is not the same as it was 230 years ago. It's not even the same form of liberalism as we had 50 years ago. And so the liberalism we have now, which I call open liberalism, has many virtues, and I think it helped win the Cold War. But it also has had enormous costs that we are still grappling with, still coming to terms with. And so we are not just practicing this kind of liberalism, but we have been infusing it into the international environment. So it kind of feeds back into our country, and it feeds into lots of other countries as well. So that's one problem, that we've been, without meaning to, not using our leverage very well, and it's come back to bite us as well as a lot of other countries. And I'm happy to elaborate on this as we go through. The second big problem is the persistence and really ongoing rise of authoritarian giants. And I mean especially the People's Republic of China, but Russia to some extent as well. These are countries, and I'll focus more on China. China has a lot more power, wealth, leverage, certainly in the long term, than Russia. These are countries run by regimes, leaders who probably we can call patriotic, but they don't want their countries to become multi-party liberal democracies. I've made this very clear. There's no mystery here. I personally think someone like Xi Jinping, President of China, General Secretary of the Communist Party, is a kind of patriot, and he really believes the party needs to have a monopoly on political power for China to be a great country. He believes that if China had free and fair elections, it would fall apart, or at least it would be very weakened. Xi Jinping is very aware of the dynamic I just described. He wouldn't use the evolutionary selection language, but he's very aware that the international environment that the United States is so influential over is biased against authoritarian government. It's deliberately biased against authority. It was set up this way after World War II. The U.S. and its allies have fiddled with it, sometimes in major ways, since World War II. But it's always been designed to protect and preserve market-based liberal democracy in the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, these wealthy countries. Other countries have joined. China sort of halfway joined some years ago. But they're very discontent with certain features of that order. And they're working with Russia and other countries to change some features of that international order, to possibly even reverse the bias, make it more biased in favor of authoritarian capitalism. And they're having some success, but not complete success. So there's a real contest going on very quietly. Sometimes it's boring. It's not that interesting to observe or write about. Sometimes it's a bit dramatic. But in human rights, in the internet, global governance of the internet, in trade, in investment, all these things, it's really a contest over what sort of international environment we're going to have in the 21st century and what kind of system it's going to select for within countries. And the last point is we have, these are not easy problems, but the United States has faced problems like this in the past with its own version of liberalism, and it has reconstituted liberalism, has rethought what kind of country, what kind of society we want and how to get there, and has made some changes. And so there's room for hope that we can do this again. The China problem is harder. And we could be looking at a world in which the U.S. and China continue to coexist in one large international order and try to contest the rules and the content of that order. We could, however, be looking at a sort of a separating international order where you have, I would say, overlapping but still distinct spheres. One where the United States and other wealthy democracies continue to do their thing, and another where China separates and has its own sphere. I don't expect to be clear some sort of radical separation, certainly not in the economic realm. We're not looking at anything like the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It did not trade, had hardly any contact. That would be way too expensive for everybody. But we might be looking at two different sets of rules that overlap but also have their own logics, and each hegemonic power operating in its own sphere, partly to reduce friction with the other. So that's the kind of from 10,000 feet what the book looks like.
Say more about ecology, the ecosystem of democracy. Is it a metaphor? What is it exactly?
Yeah. It's a metaphor. I like to think we could build a complete scientific empirical program around it. And I do have a lot of, in the footnotes in the book, lots of empirical social science that backs up these claims. But the general idea is, if you remember from biology class, that why are polar bears white? Why are animals in the Arctic white? It's because white fur gets selected for, because pretend there was a time when you had all grizzly bears and black bears. The problem is, in a snowy climate, they can be seen very easily by their prey, so the prey gets away. But a polar bear, a white bear, can't be seen, so he gets more prey. And if there are any predators that attack bears in the Arctic, I don't know what those would be, hunters maybe. Black bears and grizzlies are also easier to see than polar bears. So that's the basic story. Over time, the population of bears becomes more and more like polar bears, white bears. And, so this is a familiar story. So the metaphor is the international environment does the same sort of thing. It can select over time for democratic government and against authoritarian government, or do the reverse. And so I'll talk quickly about exactly, a little more precisely what I'm talking about. Okay. All right, so let me talk about international rules and institutions, all right, as part of the environment. 1989, those of my age or so will remember that what happened in May and June in Beijing in China, the Tiananmen Square massacre. This was this is before the Berlin Wall fell in Germany, but everyone knew something was going on in the communist world. Mikhail Gorbachev, head of the Soviet Union, was visiting China, and Chinese students loved Gorbachev. He was a hero because of the reforms he was implementing in the Soviet bloc. And so they were already out in Tiananmen Square mourning the death of a beloved reformist Chinese leader. But when they knew Gorbachev was coming to town, so they showed up, maybe 1 million students in Tiananmen Square. And if you've been there, this is a vast space. This is huge. Other Chinese cities began to have students come out in the squares as well. And this was not really a protest. It was a celebration of Gorbachev and encouraging the Chinese government, Deng Xiaoping, to do as Gorbachev's doing. And the students came and they wouldn't leave. And this made the Chinese government very nervous. And the days went by and the weeks went by. And finally, the students would not leave. And so Deng Xiaoping decided it's humiliating and it's becoming dangerous. And so he decided to send in the tanks. We don't know how many were killed. The Chinese say 200. The British say 10,000. We probably never will know. But it was a horrible event, and it made world headlines, and it really rocked the Western view of what Deng Xiaoping was up to in China. So the Europeans, North Americans, Japanese imposed very harsh economic sanctions on China in punishment. And these Japanese lifted theirs sooner than the Americans and the Europeans, but they stayed in place for quite a while. And this was not just humiliating to China, it damaged China's grand strategy for economic growth and becoming a great country again. It set them back a couple of years. Deng Xiaoping was very upset. He was surprised. He thought the West doesn't really, why do they care about what happens to Chinese people? They just care about making money. Turns out he was wrong. That politically, it was very, very difficult for President George H.W. Bush to reestablish full trade relations with China at that time. So what did the Chinese conclude? What did Deng Xiaoping conclude? The world is biased. This world that the Americans and the Europeans run is biased against us. They have this view of what they call human rights, that it's not our view. We weren't consulted about it. It's not fair. But they're running things, and they're punishing us for doing things that we have to do to keep our country together. So what do? Well, Deng commissioned a white paper that you can find on the internet about how China needs to combat this hegemonic Western view about human rights so that this won't happen again, so that when China has to do what it needs to do to stay together, it won't be punished. And so ever since then, China has been trying very subtly in international fora, in national fora, published works, now using the internet, to put out there an alternative view of human rights. It's not about the individual right to conscience or assembly, freedom of the press, religion. It's about the right to development, economic development, the right to sovereignty, to live in a sovereign country, right? And these are things that I think we would all sympathize with, but it is an alternative view, and it's one much more amenable to China's own system, and it really doesn't, it is not a part of the original UN view of human rights. So that's just, I could tell lots of stories, but that was long enough, I think. But in the internet as well, the Americans want a completely open internet, no national censorship. The Chinese have national censorship. We jokingly call it the Great Firewall. And they don't like the fact that so many other countries look down on them for this censorship, make jokes about it. It costs them, it costs their reputation. So they're also trying to make normative globally what they call internet sovereignty. Not this openness that comes out of Silicon Valley and is harmful and destructive. So anyway, in realm after realm, they're doing this. And again, they're trying to change not just their own situation, but the entire international environment, to stop favoring a system that is hostile to them and to start favoring their own system.
Okay, thank you. Not wanting to be tedious, which I'm capable of.
Never.
To be sure. But there's endless contingency in history, and I want to ask the question, what accounts for the waxing and waning of this selection process, selecting for or against the ecosystems of modern democracy? Selection, again, plays off of the analogy or the metaphor, but there are always limits to every analogy and to analogical thinking. It obscures in a way as much as it illuminates, because I am persuaded, but I want to get, just very briefly, into the question of agency. Yeah. Selecting for suggests some kind of interdependence. And more than interdependence, a kind of international solidarity. But it goes beyond interdependence to some kind of agency. And can you say anything more about that? And again, in light of the waxing and waning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll return back to the point about how the United States has this outsized power to shape the environment. So the U.S. is a big agent in this story in a way that, say, Costa Rica or Australia cannot be, except insofar as they sort of affiliate with a more powerful country and cooperate with them. So agency really, and this is an insight I draw from what we call the realist school in international relations. It says it's the powerful countries that matter the most. I think that's self-evidently true. Matter not in a moral sense, but in the sense of being the most consequential. Their political decisions and preferences are the most important, the most consequential. So how that has affected the waxing and waning, in the 1930s, this decade I keep referring back to, the U.S. was a great power, but it was by no means the only great power. Britain still was a great power, France, and Nazi Germany and Japan. Soviet Union, not clear what was going on there. But the reason why authoritarianism was on the rise globally, certainly in Europe and the Americas and Japan in the 30s, I say was in large part because Nazi Germany, and this is hard to admit and difficult to remember, was a very successful economy in the early 30s. This was the Great Depression. The liberal democracies were scrambling, floundering, trying to put men back, breadwinners back to work. The Germans and other fascist regimes were pretty good at this, partly through remilitarization, make them all soldiers and sailors, but also just heavy centralization of the economy. And this was very impressive. Lots of Americans thought, that seems to be working better than what we have. And then on the left, also, the Soviet Union had full employment. Also something working better than the Western countries. These were countries with lots of momentum. In the case of Nazi Germany, it was a rising military power as well. So that's a period when we had what we call a multipolar system, where you had genuine competition among the great powers. Since the end of World War II, there were only two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, leaving only the United States. And that's largely responsible for the hegemony of liberal market-based democracy. And so to bring that back again to China, one of my reasons why authoritarianism is so attractive and has some momentum in some parts of the world is the very impressive, even spectacular rise of China, right? Its economy, the government is able to do things very quickly to build infrastructure. They're the world leaders in infrastructure building. And they're exporting this in lots of the world through their Belt and Road Initiative. But it comes down to China's power and leverage and influence. It's very impressive. And the United States is no longer the world's only great power.
So it sounds like it is the waxing and waning, at least in the 20th century, and as it spills into the 21st, has something to do with American hegemony in the world order.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I might tell you. So agency, so you're a sociologist, social theorist. I would say my entire career I've been grappling with what we call the agent structure problem. We are individual agents, but we exist in these invisible structures that actually influence us in ways we don't know, from how we dress, how we talk, to what kind of life we want to live. I conceive of states as similar. They are agents, but they exist in an environment that influences them in invisible ways. But agency matters too. In everyday life, some agents can change the structure, can change the trends. In international life, some states can alter the international environment. But it's really the powerful, rich ones that do that. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not above being a bit shameless in any case in mentioning my own project, which came out in the early summer, Democracy and Solidarity. I want to tie these two projects together a little bit, and maybe they can't be brought together. But the great democratic revolutions of Western and Northern Europe and North America were the offspring of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was not one thing. It was different in France than it was in England and in Scotland and in Germany, and different still in the United States. And I am an Americanist. But the guiding question of my new project is the question, how does an Enlightenment-era institution survive and thrive in an increasingly post-Enlightenment world, post-Enlightenment culture? The answer is not easy, but the premise of this argument is that there is in a way, there are cultural antecedents to politics, and whatever else democracy was and is, it was an ethical vision for the reconstitution of public life in ways that would expand justice and freedom and equality, obviously, it was imperfect from the very start. And part of the story of American democracy is how it's worked through the inherent contradictions that were present at the beginning. But the fundamental question, how does an Enlightenment-era institution survive and thrive in a post-Enlightenment world? I think it does bear on the American case. But the question, I think, could just as easily be made for democracy regionally and globally. One can see this in the Atlantic Charter signed by Churchill and Roosevelt in 1941. It was infused with Enlightenment ideals. In many respects, the North Atlantic Treaty of 1949, the founding of NATO, was also a work of Enlightenment aspirations. The same can be said of the Charter of the United Nations in 1945, and certainly the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. These too reflected foundational ideals of Enlightenment hopes, and more particularly the foundation of liberal internationalism.
Yeah, you bet.
So, would you agree that there is a kind of cultural infrastructure to liberal internationalism, and therefore the kind of ecosystem that you've been talking about? And if that's true, what's happened to that?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
we'll go from there.
I do agree. You're probing more deeply into the cultural foundations than I do in my book. But yes, so you can think of this liberal international order I was describing a minute ago as an attempt by the Western countries to go global with the Enlightenment in a way. So many of the rules and institutions are underpinned by a way. And so the human rights case is probably the most obvious. So I told that story a minute ago. I won't retell it. But in 1948, one of the early things the United Nations did was promulgate a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can find this on the internet very easily, and it looks kind of familiar. Eleanor Roosevelt played a big part in it. It's not an American document; it's global, but it's definitely bears the stamp of the Western Enlightenment understanding that the individual really is the fundamental unit of society, and the individual has rights, no matter when he or she was born, where, under what circumstances, the same rights. These are human rights. They are not Americans' rights or Englishmen's rights. They're human rights, right? So really bold claims. These are, in a sense, historically new claims, and to many parts of the world, they look like Western claims, right? Like maybe that's how you do it there, and maybe someday we'll do it here, but that's not, right? So it is a real attempt, partly self-conscious, but partly kind of unwitting, to put into the global environment this notion of what society is, what a human being is, and so on. And I think one thing I've always appreciated in your work, James, is the way, so I tend to say other parts of the world don't necessarily buy into this. You're very good at uncovering how it's not clear Westerners buy into the whole package.
Right.
Now, so what do we do with that? How to re-articulate? Yeah, you just said a minute ago too. What happens to an Enlightenment set of institutions we call liberal democracy when the cultural underpinning, people understand themselves and society in a particular way? What happens when that weakens or even goes away?
Yeah.
I think that's a deep way to put the fundamental problem, and luckily I have a solution. No, there is. Yeah, I think that's, and you'll be the first to hear it. No, this is an example of how I think identifying and describing a problem is the first and early step toward helping toward remedies. I think it's the work of at least a generation to figure this one out.
Yeah.
Again, it's not. I don't want my book to be read as, oh, we have our act together. It's just these Chinese and Russians. that is not the message. If anything, I think we bear a bigger, more blame, and so we have to figure out how to. And so I put it in terms of reconceiving liberalism. What's the right way to think about human freedom? Have we gone astray on that? And so I do introduce at the end of the book what I call pluralist liberalism. It is hazy, deliberately hazy, because I'll kid you, because I don't want to presume to put a really precise program out there. It would either get ignored or shot down.
Right.
You know, that's what we do. But I do start to sketch what I think, some things I think are wrong with what I call open liberalism, and why pluralist liberalism would be better. So open liberalism, if I can talk about that for a minute, because I think it relates to this.
But I also want to keep an eye on the time, and
we might miss our flights, yeah.
Well, I know Vivian is going to be waving a flag at us pretty quickly, and I do have one important question. Why don't we save that for the Q&A?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
It may take a generation, but we may not have a generation. I think that at least is a sensibility that is widely shared. And it's also opaque, but I'm okay with opaque, because I think when you understand the nature of solidarity as something more than just a cognitivist or rationalist form of coming together, solidarity depends in certain respects upon opacity. So it's okay. We can push that further in Q&A. I'm also, again, because I'm mindful of the time and the run of show here, I'm going to skip over Russia and China and hope that questions are asked about Russia and China from the audience when we move to Q&A. Also, the cycles of isolationism and internationalism, important questions that are addressed in John's book. You know, in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Condoleezza Rice writes about the temptation toward isolationism in this moment. But I want to push to a final question here, because I think it is implicit in our conversation. You know, I wrote Culture Wars, which a long time ago, which is about polarization and its nature, and there's been a lot of ink spilled on that topic, but very few have been writing on the question of solidarity. In a way, it's the opposite side of the coin. It's not just the pluribus, it's the unum. Yeah. What is it that holds the something together? And my conclusion is that it may not be true in the international order, and especially in the way that you talk about the possibility of a bipolar arrangement, or bipolar hegemons, if you will. But most institutions, I believe all institutions, all organizations, and even a nation, there has to be some modicum of solidarity. Otherwise, a nation isn't governable. Yeah. And if solidarity can't be generated in some respects organically, it will be imposed coercively, authoritatively. And I think that's in part my take on the rise of authoritarianism, both here and abroad. But the question comes to the international order and about the kind of strong ecosystem that America has led in support of liberal internationalism. We see it weakening. That is really the point of your book. In the old world systems theory, there's a kind of provocative question. At the end of a hegemonic cycle, when there's a contest for position within the global order and global capitalism, at least from that perspective, these transitions are almost always, if not always, met with war. And that's a big question. Yeah. What's your assessment?
Yeah.
And then we'll move to Q&A.
How pessimistic, how gloomy is this anyway? This question came up a lot during the Soviet-American Cold War as well. Now that ended not in war, but in the collapse of one side, which was extremely harmful on that side. And Russians are still paying the price for it, but better than World War III, I think most of us would say. Regarding, so it is possible to have a hegemonic transition, but this is when you switch from, say, a bipolar to a unipolar system, or from a unipolar back to a bipolar, as we seem to be in now. It is possible for those to happen without a major war. On our side, and this is a paradox, nuclear deterrence, actually, I'm one of the people who thinks it works to keep the superpowers from attacking each other. Each knows that an attack on the other would come back to bite it in a really horrible way, and so they just don't do it. It's not a satisfactory position. It's morally heavily problematic, but I think empirically it does keep the peace. So in a gloomy, grisly way, we have that on our side for now. But I also think that it is possible, so it's possible for a minimal understanding of international order to triumph, but it's going to be very minimal. One thing the West and the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians have in common is a desire to trade for, if not completely free trade and free investment, movement of capital. Limited, and this was not true of the Soviets and the Americans or Mao Zedong's China and the West during most of the Cold War. Just was not the case. Okay. And so this is not a satisfactory basis for a domestic order at all. I agree. Solidarity has to reside in more than simply the ability to conduct commerce with each other. But it might be that the best we can do globally, if we really want to avoid the deep conflicts James is alluding to, that we need to talk very frankly about what's possible, what we do have in common, and not try to force ourselves to have more in common than we do, than we can.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll leave it there. Let's open it up for Q&A. I want to begin with a graduate student. Rule of thumb, always begin with a graduate student.
It's a good rule.
Or an undergraduate, a student.
A student.
Not a student of life. Everyone here is that, but we'll start here, and then we'll move here, and then we'll open it up.
So I just wanted to ask about when you were talking about America as a leader in this world kind of ecological system, and how we have to leverage our strength of democracy on other countries potentially, whether they are already democratic and their democracies are weakening, or they are going through some kind of coup and they are changing their governmental systems. What are kind of your suggestions, or could you elaborate on what you think America should do? As in, we have done things like that in the past, your Vietnams, your Middle East, et cetera, but moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about military intervention, among other things, right? So yeah, part of, I didn't get into this, but yes, one way the United States, and not just the US, Soviets did this, tried to shape the environment in their favor, is to export democracy, or at least export non-communism, anti-communism, as we did in the Cold War a lot. I think that fits into the framework nicely. The framework doesn't give precise advice about how to do that well or whether to do it at all. It just says there's an incentive to do it. The U.S., there's a lot of scholarship on how the U.S. isn't that good at this, right? We're fooled by the successes after World War II in Japan, Italy, and Germany. Those did work. Well, they worked because those were completely defeated countries. Their regimes were completely discredited. And they also had a common enemy, Soviet communism. And so those conditions are pretty rare. Also, the U.S. just occupied these countries in a big way for many years. Those are rare conditions, and the U.S. paid a price it just is not willing to pay anymore. So I think we have to draw on prudence in this case and realize the Bush 43 administration tried this again in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it didn't work. Those conditions hadn't lined up in that way. So the incentive is still there. I would say if I could wave a magic wand and make this happen, I would do it, but there is no wand. Instead, we're dealing with actual concrete conditions, and so more prudence is called for in this generation, I think.
You had your hand up before, yes?
Thank you guys both so much for your time today.
Stand up, please.
Oh, stand. I just, since we kind of didn't have time earlier, I was wondering if you could go into the concepts of like open and pluralist liberalism and what a transition between the two of those might look like.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I'll gallop through. I say there are three historical stages of liberalism. Classical, which will be familiar if you take political theory, the liberalism of the American founding and Anglo-American world of the late 18th and 19th centuries. This is small government, individual liberty means, basically it's white men to start with, and then emancipation of slaves expands that a bit. But a free householder able to move unencumbered by the government, except in some very small ways. That gave way to welfare liberalism in the early 20th century, which is a much more, which reconceived human liberty. Early welfare liberals, people like John Dewey, said, you know what, I'm looking out at America, I'm seeing a lot of people who are formally free, but they don't really have freedom. It's this vast working class that the Industrial Revolution created. They don't look free to me, they don't have any bargaining power, they have pretty lousy conditions, lousy life prospects. So they built a different kind of liberalism that actually says we need the state to intrude to ensure individual liberty. And so the articulations of welfare liberalism are very much about human freedom, but it's the freedom to, as a factory or mine worker, to collectively bargain. Also, the government redistributes wealth and so on. So that's welfare liberalism. That gave way in the 70s and 80s to what I call open liberalism, which is not simply a return to old classical liberalism. It's much more cosmopolitan than that. So open liberals, and you can find chapter and verse on this, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s said, human freedom really, it's not really about government intrusion anymore. It's about lifting all barriers to individual emancipation, both economic and really cultural barriers. And national barriers become suspect. These nations, these national borders we have, they're legacies of the past. What we really should aim for is a world in which capital, goods, services, and humans can move freely across borders. So the European Union is this in action. But their open liberals want this to be eventually true of the world. And there's a culture that comes along with this. It's not just about economic efficiency. But one conceives of oneself as open to self-creation, and there's no resting place. It's what one sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, calls liquid modernity. This is the kind of world we want to have. It's the world of human fulfillment. And it really comes down to letting the individual decide for him or herself or themselves what they'll be. And yeah.
I was going to say, it's not reducible to what is called, fortunately or unfortunately, neoliberalism.
Yeah.
But it is, but neoliberalism, a kind of market fundamentalism that empowered globalization, reinforces this broader culture of...
That's right. It's integral to
Yep.
it. So the economic program has been, let's get rid of all barriers to international movement of goods and capital. And culturally, it has been a kind of an urban, sophisticated culture that's alienated. The same people that have lost their industrial jobs also find this very culturally alienated. Most of them, or a lot of them, live in small towns and communities. When you take away the kind of traditional institutions of all sorts, civil society we call it, they don't have a lot left, and so they drift. And so in the book I make a case that others have made too, that lots of the opioid addiction, now fentanyl addiction, we're seeing in the suicide rates and so on, they're concentrated in these communities, and it's partly because of the excesses of open liberalism. So I put out there something called pluralist liberalism that still is very concerned with individual liberty. I think certainly as Americans, that is who we are. That's in the DNA. Individual liberty is where we start. But if you look around, a lot of people don't look or feel like they're free. So it's a little bit like the 1930s. Again, I keep bringing up the 30s, but in that sense. But I'm groping in the book toward a liberalism that allows people, that validates, traditional, and in some ways, in some cases, new communities, boundaries. Some people actually want to stop choosing and just commit to a community, to a family, to a job, to a religion, to a country, They don't like the completely open. Some people thrive on that, others don't. And if there's a way to get to a liberalism that doesn't penalize commitment, I guess that's how I put it really succinctly, then I think we need to try to get there. We need to talk about what that looks like in law and policy. Yeah. We need to talk about the foundations of it, why that's a good thing. And again, that is the work of a generation, I think.
That's right, for sure. For sure. Another question here in the blue shirt? Yes, woman, yeah, there you go. Actually, I was pointing at her, yes, right.
One of the things that seems to me is really different from both the 1930s and also the Cold War and when China was locked down is the movement of people globally. Mm-hmm. So costs have come down, legal barriers have come down. I mean, all you have to do is look at the percentage of international students and specifically Chinese in American universities. And I was curious how you see that influencing the world order, really.
I mean, I'll just say as a normative, personal matter, I love openness, and I have spent, sabbaticals in different countries, and I've visited many countries, and I have colleagues, and we just call this a republic of letters. I have academics in Asia and Europe and Africa and Middle East and in South America. I value them. So I think of us as a kind of a community. But that's a kind of open liberalism, and I'm a beneficiary of it. I do think that it's not the only element. It's probably the biggest flashpoint politically in this country and in parts of Europe. Immigration. Immigration does an economic thing and a cultural thing, and both have alienated lots of people. The economic thing is all else equal. This is very complicated empirical, but all else equal, it drives down wages of, if it's unskilled labor, it drives down wages of unskilled laborers who already live there, and it's just a question of supply and demand in labor markets. So it also limits within country immigration. So if you're in Oklahoma and there's a recession and you think I could move to California where the jobs are, well, the jobs actually aren't there because more people are coming in from outside the country there. So there are cases where that's not as severe a problem, but it's an all else equal economics argument. Culturally, also, if you're in a small town or community that's already in distress, then lots of immigrants can change the culture, and you find yourself just in a place you don't recognize, right? It's easy for this to slide into bigotry, and I just want to flag that and I'm not calling it, let's empower bigotry. But I think those of us who have benefited from open liberalism need to grapple with this, that it's really helped. It's helped me in my career. What's not to like about it? It hasn't helped a lot of people, and it's a delicate thing, but I think it's a real thing. Yeah.
I was also thinking about the flow of ideas, say, back to China.
Yeah.
You have a larger and larger percentage of your country that's lived abroad.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great benefit of openness, of open liberalism, the free flow of ideas. That's one of the things I love about it, and I think it's been a great benefit. So I had a quick story. In the late 80s, I did a master's, and one of my classmates was Chinese, and he was a bit older than me. He'd been through the Cultural Revolution, had been sent down to the countryside, worked on a farm, and now he was in graduate school in the States, so he had made it through. And he went on to get a PhD in economics in the States. And he went back and worked at the Bank of China, and he became eventually China's top representative at the International Monetary Fund in Washington. And I think this is an enormous benefit of that openness. I have trouble calculating just how important that is. And he's not the only one. There are lots of Chinese that did this. And so this is what makes it a really hard problem. I'm certainly, I would not call for let's close up, and I think that's really counterproductive and harmful. But I think this, unreflective, open everything up all the time right away brings some cost with it as well. So.
At the very back.
One of the points you summarized for your book, you said that U.S. hasn't used its leverage to spread liberal democracy or liberalism. And so I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the fact that not only did it not spread liberalism, I mean, it actively contributed to establishment, overthrowing democracies and establishing authoritarian regimes or fascist regimes.
Right.
And so your thoughts on that and the theme that I'm sensing about, that we have in current culture about making American democracy great again, as if it was sometimes great and we lost a golden age. I mean, it's an evolving thing, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on the last point, I'll say I think it's in worse shape than it has been in the past. So, maybe we don't like the language of greatness, but I do think I would defend the thesis. I think lots of people hold that it's in a bad way. It's been better. All right, the 90s were better for democracy in this country and elsewhere. As to U.S. Promotion of authoritarianism, this is not only a Cold War story, but the Cold War is when it happened the most. I would say even today in the Middle East, the U.S. is not comfortable with free and fair elections. Ironically, it was George W. Bush who pushed this in Iraq, let's remember, in Palestine as well. Why is Hamas running Gaza? Well, because there were elections. And so Bush learned, and Obama after him, and Trump and Biden, maybe this isn't the time for free and fair elections in some of these Middle Eastern countries, right? Because it brings governments that certainly don't like us and can be destructive toward their own people. So these are hard problems. In the Cold War, the United States, I said in passing a few minutes ago, the United States acted to promote liberal democracy or at least to block communism. There were cases all over what we then called the Third World where liberal democracy just wasn't, conditions were not right for it. It was hard to find politicians who could guarantee that that's the system that would be in place. And so the U.S. and Britain and France and other countries actually said that our second best option is to have an anti-communist authoritarian in place. That was could lead to some horrible results in some cases. But the point I still emphasize is that the Americans weren't neutral about what kind of government should be in place in these countries. They were trying to shape the environment at least to block Soviet communism. And again, this is not a moral endorsement of what they did. It's just the theory says they should try to shape the environment in a particular way. I'm saying they did within the limits that the Cold War imposed on them. So.
Okay.
Sorry, just kind of bouncing off of that, and thank you both for being here. How do you kind of balance those nuances with the view of like an ecological political system, kind of like taking something that's not a science and trying to force it into this like kind of lens? How do you grapple with that?
Yeah, so it's a question of metaphor, right? I think this afflicts lots of social science, social theory. We borrow, right? Now, if there are any historians in the room, you're all, of course you guys do that. This is why I should have become a historian. You don't have to worry about these things. But I do think, so I just look at the broad sweep of history and I see these regularities, let's call them, and I think, so what happened, the quick story is about 8 years ago I had a glorious year-long sabbatical in Germany, and I had freedom to read what I wanted. So I started reading a lot of evolutionary theory. Coevolution really interested me. Coevolution is usually defined as agents, some species shaping the environment, the way beavers chop down trees to build dams. That actually steers natural selection in a different direction than it would because they have manipulated the environment. So I got really interested in this, right? And then I began to read how economists, sociologists, anthropologists apply evolutionary thinking to their subject matter. And I, went down a few rabbit holes there. But I began to think, this is useful. This is a helpful way to think about the international environment and what's wrong with, why so many countries are having trouble with their democracies right now. I think there's something in the environment, and we can. So that's why one does this, and you can push it, and there are limits to it. It's a metaphor. It's an analogy. But I do think it's fruitful to push into it a bit. Yeah.
I mean, Aristotle said a very long time ago that human beings, the very nature of thinking for human beings is to think in pictures, and it's a picture, and
It's a picture.
The analogy works if it resonates in some respects, but again, the limitations need to be understood,
Yeah.
and the analogy needs to be pushed as
Yeah.
far as it can, and I think it can be.
I think one job, if I put it out there, I do need to push as far as I can, and maybe push a little beyond what it would bear, just to see how far it'll go. So that's what I do in the
Well, and just one quick thought. I mean, you won't find this in Durkheim, but well, actually, you will find it in Durkheim. But you know, there is an affirmative solidarity, a shared sense of common beliefs and common ideals and the like. But probably as powerful, if not more powerful, in history is a negative solidarity, having a good enemy. And we are brought together, in fact, you know, through the Cold War, the Western world was brought together.
That's right.
So I put all of that, of course, in quotes, but yeah, I think it could be pushed further, and it would be fun to do.
Okay.
Want to write something?
We'll do, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, let's talk.
I think it's, we've got to just...
try my question again, I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah.
The change to me, and this is a somewhat inchoate question you've touched on a couple times, but in the ecosystem seems to be, to me, very interrelated to the rise of information technology, of social media, somehow the granular nature of our empirical understanding of the world being so changed by algorithms, by the internet. Could you talk a bit about your new sort of formulation of liberalism? Does it recommend another intrusion in individual liberty to kind of assess and I'm thinking in particular about the asymmetry between a closed society like the People's Republic of China and our open society, and sort of that specific asymmetry, that specific weakness that we seem to have in this regard. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good and tough question. So the technologies we have, I think, do accelerate and contribute to open liberalism, made it even more open, and change is much faster. And I don't think, I mean, one can in one's own life, in one's own family, limit these technologies. Lots of families, I applaud families like my own tried this, to limit the degree to which these these things in my pocket. By the way, my phone just rang as you were asking your question, so these things can be so annoying. So there are ways to limit their effect, but we're not going to get rid of these things. And now AI is here. Quantum computing is coming. It's going to be commercially viable, I guess, soon. So we're not going to get rid of these things. And one thing, all I'll say is I do worry. I'm not a technological determinist, but in my worst moments I start to become one. And I think if this really is, if the problems that I see are propelled, at least in large part by technology, and we're not getting rid of the technology, what happens? Can we have the pluralistic liberalism I think we need? And again, I like to think so, but if it just involves private individuals deciding to tame the technology or get rid of it, sure, that'll work for some people. It's not going to work for a lot of people. No. And so I don't know the answer, but I think you're hitting on one of the hardest things about our moment, actually. So.
I think we've got time for one more question. We go until 1:10?
Well, 1:15.
1:15, okay. Well, we can get everyone now.
5 minutes.
Len first, and then we'll come back over here.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the openness to capital flows across borders, which you just barely mentioned. But if you think about the difference between the period in which the German, Italian, Japanese democracies were nurtured and the more recent period, one big difference is in that earlier period we had very limited international capital flows. Yeah. And that was what enabled these countries to build industrial welfare, capitalism of various kinds that had the kind of solidarity that James was talking about. So would you recommend in this, in the United States' ability to influence its environment, that it might consider moving away from the degree of capital openness that we have now, money sloshing in and out of economies, in communities, leaving people unemployed, et cetera?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not an economist. I I like the sound of that. I completely agree with your story about the 50s, 60s in the these post-war economies, and I don't. So capital controls of some kind immediately occur to people like me as a way to. I know this is not popular with lots of imported people, and to say the least. And there are real costs, right? There are efficiency gains to having free-flowing capital. It's just, but the loss is now palpable, and so my tentative answer is yes. I don't know what it looks like. I'm wary of taking this too far, as some countries have done. But I do think movements of capital, as well as goods and services, has to be rethought in our moment. Yeah.
Over here? Yeah.
So,
Vivian, I'm trying to get your steps in.
thank you. One of the challenges for liberal democracy is that it's being attacked from multiple sides. So it's been attacked by authoritarianism, but there's also a lot of critique from other perspectives of radical democracy. So I come from the liberative Democrat community. Right?
Okay.
And following what you were presenting, I think two of the critiques for what would be either classical liberal democracy or the more deliberative liberal democracy have to do with one, moving towards more acceptance of difference and incorporation of difference, inclusion of difference, which I think aligns with your perspective of open liberalism. But the other one has to do with tweaking the tools and the institutions and moving away from aggregative, decision-making methodologies and techniques, and incorporating others that have more to do with mutual understanding and mutual inclusion and deliberation. And so I think I have a sense of what your perspective is on the whole diversity and inclusion. But how about the incorporating non-aggregative tools and these windows for more instruments for mutual understanding, more innovations for mutual understanding, and the role that would play in your vision?
Yeah. The first thing I think of, so deliberative. I like the way you've set that out. So I get concerned about the size of the United States and deliberative democracy. I don't think. Sometimes we try this. Maybe we're trying this in a macro sense now. It's just not working out very well. And so I think my pluralist liberalism isn't very fleshed out. But I would like to. The first thing I would want to explore is, on the more meso and micro level, is deliberative democracy going to be more productive in the 21st century? Because, deliberation at 320 million person scale, vast geographical area, just seems very hard. Easier in a place like Denmark, but right. So the hazard there is that you end up with quite a heterogeneous polity where some things are treated as rights in one part that aren't in another, right? So, and that's a hazard to really grapple with as well. But I think I would say the feeling of alienation that has real consequences for the entire country that a lot of people experience on an ongoing basis. And I don't just mean the populist right. I mean a lot of people who identify with the left feel the same. Tells us there's something about running a 320 million person democracy that we're not doing right. And I think relocating a bit more power at the local level is one tool in the toolbox we need to take quite seriously. And deliberative democracy, it seems to me, is a natural part of that story. So
It's 1:15, and I've gotten the red flag, so I want to thank all of you for coming to today's event, and I want to thank my colleague and friend John Owen for his work. Please join me in.